Hi, my name is Chris Morash, and welcome to this year's Dublin City Library's UNESCO City of Literature lecture. This year, what we're going to be looking at are Dublin's hidden literary neighbourhoods. Now, Dublin's a city where we often feel the presence of the city's writers. It's a city, perhaps more than any other, that has been imagined by its writers. Anyone who lives here in the city knows this. But there are some places where we are more aware of the writers than others. Here, for instance, along the banks of the Grand Canal, when we encounter John Call's statue of Patrick Kavanagh, we feel, here's a place where my experience of being in the city has been shaped by a writer. That it would be different to be here if Kavanagh had not been here first and had written about it. I have been thinking of making my grove, he writes, on the banks of the Grand Canal near Baggot Street Bridge, where in recent days I've rediscovered my roots. He wrote that in 1959, just after coming out of hospital. My hagera was to the Grand Canal bank, where again I saw the beauty of water and green grass and the magic of light. The result of those rediscovered roots was a poem that I would venture that if you asked 100 Dubliners to name their favourite poem, would be coming up in just about everybody's list. Grand Canal Walk, or lines written on a seat near the Grand Canal, Dublin. Two poems that Patrick Kavanagh wrote about this little stretch of water. Leafy with love banks and the green waters of the canal, pouring redemption for me that I do, the will of God, wallow in the habitual, the banal, grow with nature again as before I grew. So here's a place where we can say, this is a writer's city. But what I've begun to wonder is this: what about the less obvious streets? The Grand Canal is certainly a place of writing, but what happens when we go only a few streets away and the writer's imagining doesn't seem so close to the surface? For instance, Herbert Place is only a few minutes from Grand Canal Bridge and the bench that we saw with the statue of Patrick Kavanagh on it. There's a stillness here, however, in spite of the street running along the canal. Few cars, few people. Outside of the morning commute, there's bikes. No pubs spilling over with poets. It's very much part of the leafy with love banks of the canal, and yet it's quieter, more reserved. It's quieter again, just around the corner, where the end of Upper Mount Street meets the canal at Hubban Bridge. In his marvellous book of essays about Dublin, published in 2021, Intimate City, Peter Sirr begins with this little turn of the road by the Pepper Canister Church. We can see someone there now sitting on a bench like a daytime ghost, he writes. What we notice, as we always notice, even in non-plague times, is that no one lives here. No one is leaning against an upper window with a cup of coffee in hand. No one is resting a bag of shopping on a porch while fumbling for a key. Or, if people do live here, they keep to themselves. At any rate, it's not what we think of as a literary neighbourhood. But the thing is, if you dig a bit more deeply, these quiet streets are alive with Dublin writers. And in order to find those writers, I think what we'll do next is go to Pearse Street Library. I've pulled a few books off the shelf to help us take a peek behind the shutters and doors around Herbert Street, to see the writer's city that's there, hiding in plain sight, as it were. Let's go back to Patrick Kavanagh for a moment. Even though he was, of course, born in Monaghan, and some of his best-known poems, like Shannon Duff or The Great Hunger, were written about the small farms of Monaghan, he lived actually most of his life in Dublin. And around the bit of the Grand Canal where I was just walking, Kavanagh is an inescapable presence. From 1948 until 1958, he rented an apartment at 62 Pembroke Road, just off Upper Baggot Street. The memoirist and writer John Ryan remembers meeting him there in his bedsit in a tall, late Georgian building. The main room was a desolation, ankle-deep in papers and typescript. This became Kavanagh's home turf. "If ever you go to Dublin town in 100 years or so," he writes in the 1953 poem of that name, "inquire for me in Baggot Street and what I was like to know." When he did move to Pembroke Road in 1958, he didn't go far. He lived variously in rented rooms at 19 Raglan Road, 110 Baggot Street, 1 Wilton Place, 37 Upper Mount Street, and 136 Leeson Street, all not very far from that same stretch of Grand Canal. It was in this patch of Dublin, then, that Patrick Kavanagh created his distinctive urban pastoral, poems that had the same sense of wonder and simplicity as some of his earliest work about rural Monaghan, but are still very much urban poems. Some have entered into the collective consciousness of the city so deeply that they have a life detached from their author. For instance, On Raglan Road, from 1946, is a poem that has entered the collective consciousness of Dubliners as a song, so that we can't help but hear the voice of Luke Kelly of the Dubliners, who sang it to the air of the dawning of the day. "On Raglan Road, on an autumn day, I met her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I might one day rue. I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day." Between being sung and being recited, this poem has become part of the memory of Dublin, and we hear it bubbling up in all sorts of unexpected places. Paula Meehan's poem, Home, about a very different Dublin in 1996, has a line that echoes Kavanagh's. "On Grafton Street in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge," which is Kavanagh's line, becomes for Meehan, "On Grafton Street in November, I heard a mighty sound. A travelling man with a didgeridoo blew me clear to Botany Bay." Patrick Kavanagh's Grand Canal poems seem to contain the secret of a redeemed city, where it's possible to wallow in the habitual. For this loneliest of gregarious writers, the canal is a kind of elongated park that finally offered a way of being alone in a city that was not the same as being lonely. Somewhere where the place itself was a sufficient consoling presence. Paula Meehan's not the only poet in whose work Kavanagh's Dublin echoes. What's probably one of the best poems by the much beloved Brendan Kennelly, who passed away in October of 2021, is set here. Like Kavanagh, Kennelly was from rural Ireland, North Kerry in his case, but he lived most of his life in Dublin, and he wrote about it. This is the beginning of his poem, Begin. "Begin again to the summoning birds, to the sight of light at the window. Begin to the roar of morning traffic all along Pembroke Road. Every beginning is a promise, born in light and dying in dark, determination and exaltation of springtime, flowering the way to work." And the poem ends with those resonant lines, "Something that will not acknowledge conclusion insists that we forever begin." However, even before Kennelly wrote this poem, the area around Baggot Street Bridge had such a presence in the city's literary imagination that it had acquired a name, Bagatonia. Now, what's perhaps most remarkable about Bagatonia is that even though it was in the center of the city, near the seat of government, it feels like a village, although it's not one that we'll find on any municipal map. "The boundaries of Bagatonia are mysteriously fluid," observes the novelist John Banville in his personal memoir of Dublin, Timepieces, from 2016. "It's a matter of associations," says Banville. He says, "The leafier lower stretch of Pearse Place is certainly part of it, and the western end of Lower Mount Street, where it runs into Marion Square, are characteristic examples of Bagatonia. But the street itself, Lower Mount Street, is not. Such are the enigmas of urban life." In general terms, however, let's say Bagatonia follows the Grand Canal from Pearse Place across Baggot Street Bridge, up Mespel Road as far as Leeson Street Bridge. Where Baggot Street cuts across the canal, it forms a second axis, extending along Lower Baggot Street as far as, but not into, Stephen's Green, but certainly up to 13 Fitzwilliam Place, where in the 1950s there was an infamous Bohemian warren of basement flats known as the Catacombs, which feature quite prominently in J.P. Dunleavy's 1955 novel, The Ginger Man. It was here that Anthony Cronin, Brandon Behan, and others lived and often drank. What interests me equally, however, is that there are many writers who lived and worked in these streets who were not part of the literary pub scene of the 1940s and 50s, but nonetheless inhabited this part of the city. The Waterford-born playwright, for instance, Teresa Deevy, had a flat at 16 Waterloo Road all throughout the 1940s and 50s. She was friendly with the painter and playwright Jack B. Yeats, brother of William Butler Yeats, who lived around the corner at 18 Fitzwilliam Square. Yeats was next door neighbours to the great Irish naturalist Robert Lloyd Prager, who lived at number 19. If you go out of Fitzwilliam Square in the direction of the Grand Canal, you come to Lad Lane, which is where the novelist and short story writer Mary Lavin had a flat at number 11. Now again, we associate her mostly with rural Ireland. She lived in Bective, County Meath, and her best-known collection of stories is called Tales from Bective Bridge. But she still kept the flat in the city, and it's where she did much of her writing. Colm Tobin recalls that in 1972, when he first came to Dublin, he said, "You could see Mary Lavin in the city, in Bewley's, in Grafton Street, or in the Country Shop restaurant, or in the National Library." Now, apart from being supplied with a canal, a bookshop, there was Parsons' bookshop right on the bridge itself, and a quantum of pubs, Bagatonia had its own publisher. In 1951, Liam Miller opened what would be one of the most important literary publishers of the 20th century, the Dolman Press, at 23 Upper Mount Street, just around the corner from the Pepper Canister Church. He later moved his premises around, closer to the canal, to 8 Herbert Place, and he lived nearby at 94 Lower Baggot Street. Gaunt and bearded as a Talmudic scholar, Liam was a book designer and printer of genius, the poet John Montague later wrote. Among Dolman's many publications was an early series of the journal Poetry Ireland. When the title was revived in 1967 as Poetry Ireland Review, it settled into premises in 44 Upper Mount Street, which also housed a library named for Austin Clarke. And it was here, in Upper Mount Street, that a young John Banville first lived when he moved to Dublin from his native Wexford. He was staying with an aunt who had a flat there. I arrived in Dublin toward the end of the McDade age, when the literary topers and talkers were on their last legs, he writes. Kavanagh, who was by then visibly dying, would sit for hours on the steps outside the house where my flat was, and he would glare at the offices of Dolman Press across the road. Later, Banville would give his literary pathologist detective Quirk, who appears in the Benjamin Black novels, the flat that Banville himself shared with his aunt in Upper Mount Street, although Banville admits that he smartened it up considerably. Now, looking back at this period, the poet and novelist Leland Bardwell, in her memoir, A Restless Life, recalls that coming into this part of Dublin in the 1960s, when Patrick Kavanaugh was ill and in the final stages of disease really brought on by alcoholism, Brendan Behan in the same sort of situation, she said, "Writers, artists, and composers do not self-destruct in the same way anymore. At least it's rare." When she arrived in this literary world in the early 1960s, she lived initially, again, in this area, in a flat in Upper Mount Street, Pembroke Road, where she describes the fleas dancing like sunbeams in the hayseeds. But she finally settled into a basement flat at 33 Lower Leeson Street. She says this, "In this deep Georgian basement, the main room, stone-floored and gritty, went the whole width of the flat. It ended in a gas fire with a powdered burner. The entrance, a blackened porch, contained a leaky sink and a greasy gas cooker. As in every dungeon, the walls wept, but at least for this vegetal apartment, we paid £2 a week. Now, Bardwell became close friends with Patrick Kavanagh in his final years, but also became a kind of mentor to a rising generation of writers. These included Eileen de Quillon, Paul Durkin, Michael Hartnett, and MacDara Woods. Bardwell's dripping basement flat became for a time what she calls, with more than a tinge of irony, a salon, although far from the kind of salon in which Yeats or A.E. participated 50 years previously. Now, the distance between that world of weeping walls and the same area today can be measured in property values. In 2018, a building a few doors down from the one that Bardwell rented for £2 a week sold for $1.25 million. Part of the reason that that area had such a vibrant, if chaotic, literary culture in the 1950s and 60s was because it was still possible for a writer to live there cheaply. Those few writers who do live in the area today, such as Colm Tóibín, who has a house just off Fitzwilliam Square, are living in very different circumstances to Bardwell's damp basement. It was the fact that rent here, in what is now some of the most expensive real estate in the city, was so cheap, was one of the things that then allowed creativity to flourish in so many ways. Bagatonia at its peak had two financially non-viable but adventurous theatres. The Lantern Theatre Club, which ran from 1957 to 67, mostly in a basement in Lower Mount Street, and the Pike, located on Herbert Lane, an even quieter little alley that runs between two quiet streets, Herbert Place and Herbert Street. It's hard to picture it now, absorbing the almost staid stillness of Herbert Street. But in the 1950s, Brendan Behan lived at number 15, and the poet John Montague lived a few doors down. Much later, in a poem entitled Herbert Street Revisited, John Montague writes of this time. He writes, "A light is burning late in this Georgian Dublin street. Someone is living our old lives. So put back the leaves on the tree. Put the tree back in the ground. Let Brendan trundle his corpse down the street singing like Molly Malone." Montague later commented of the neighbour. He said, "You couldn't shovel a load of coal into a basement without disrupting an avant-garde play." Now, although it only lasted from 1953 to 1961, the Pike Theater there in Herbert Lane holds an important place in Irish theatre history. With a tiny performance space and only a 55-seat auditorium crammed into a converted coach house with the yard covered over to make the auditorium, the Pike was the creation of Caroline Swift and her husband, the director Alan Simpson, to give, as they wrote, theatre-goers opportunities to see more of the struggle going on at present in world theatre. Swift later described its mixture of gilt and plaster cupids and Regency wallpaper as, quote, "a weird cross between Covent Garden and a doll's house." But it was in this theatre, in 1954, November 19th, that Brendan Behan's play The Queerfellow was first performed. And it was here that the Irish premiere of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot took place on October 28, 1955, only a few months after its English language debut in London. Having run for 2 years in Paris in a théâtre de poche that is little bigger than the Pike, it is ideally suited to our resources, wrote the Pike newsletter. Now, Beckett, at this point, had been living in Paris for quite some time, but he remained in close contact with friends in Dublin. So when Alan Simpson from the Pike wrote in late 1953 asking if he could stage Waiting for Godot at the Pike, Beckett replied to say that he was still in the process of translating the play, which he had originally written in French. He said, translating it into English as literally as I could, but he doubted that it would be able to be staged in Dublin because of what Beckett referred to as certain crudities of language. Now, Alan Simpson took this at face value and considered the translation that Beckett sent him as a work in progress. And his immediate reaction was to play the two tramps in Waiting for Godot, Dee and Gogo, as Dublin characters. So, Alan Simpson set about doing something that today would seem unimaginable because Beckett's plays are quite famously conformed to the script. Alan Simpson set about rewriting Waiting for Godot, writing it into Dublinese, if you like. So, when Vladimir speculates that the largely mute character of Lucky would be, if he got going all of a sudden, the script says, we'd be bollocksed. Simpson amended this to the uniquely Dublin word banjaxed, which means more or less the same thing, but you'd only find it in Dublin. Estragon's suggestion about Lucky, suppose we gave him a good beating, in Beckett's words, became, in Alan Simpson's version, what if we wired into him? Likewise, the suggestion that they find new names for Lucky's master, Pozzo, would be amusing, this is Beckett's word amusing, became in Simpson's, it'd be gas. Now, by contrast, Simpson cast an actor with what he described as a rich, fruity Anglo-Irish voice as Pozzo, who he dressed in a tweed jacket and cape and played him as an Anglo-Irish or English gentleman. Now, a tree, a country road, evening. It may not have looked like Dublin, but in 1955, Waiting for Godot at the Pike certainly sounded like Dublin. They seem to have done a good job at the Pike, Beckett wrote from Paris to a Dublin friend. He said, in spite of Simpson's minor improvements with the text. The whole affair is so simple, wrote Beckett. And it really was. I mean, this production in 1955 was an exemplary case of, as Beckett put it, finding no symbols where none intended. But the other thing that happened was that in the Pike Godot, the sound of a Dublin voice made what was at the time a really challenging piece of avant-garde literature into part of the fabric of the city. Now, you have to remember, in 1955, audiences found Waiting for Godot almost incomprehensible. Audiences walked out. Vivian Mercier wrote in the Irish Times about people being puzzled by a play in which nothing happens twice. But in Dublin, it became part of the fabric of the city. The quintessential Dublin comedian, Jimmy O'Dea, introduced Godot into his routines in the Gaiety Theatre. Tramps Waiting for Godot began to feature in cartoons in the Dublin newspapers. And the Pike actually had a hit on its hands. So much so that Swift and Simpson had to actually rent a bigger theatre, the Gaiety Theatre, the following March and embark on an Irish tour. Patrick Kavanagh went to see it, of course. He only lived around the corner. And he praised it in the Irish Times because of its, what he called, its awareness of the peculiar sickness of society. Brendan Behan not only saw Waiting for Godot, he joined in one evening. Sitting in the back of the auditorium, by his own admission, having had a few jars, there's a part of the play where one of the tramps is talking about the possibility of hanging himself. And he says, well, if I hung myself and the tree broke, how would you hang yourself? And he says, when you're dead, who will pull the rope? And Behan was in the back of the stalls with a few jars under his belt, and he said, I will. The streets around the Pike also had a deeply personal significance for Beckett. I had 2 dreadful months in Dublin this summer, he wrote to a friend in December of 1950. I hope I shall never go back there. My mother died in July. Beckett's mother, May, had suffered from Parkinson's disease, and she spent her final 2 months in the Marion Nursing Home at 21 Herbert Street, 6 doors down from where Brendan Behan would live, and backing on to Herbert Lane, where the Pike is located. The location appears in Samuel Beckett's 1958 play, Krapp's Last Tape, in which an elderly man, Krapp, sits listening to recordings he has made of himself every year on his birthday, flicking at random between moments in a life. At last he comes upon a tape in which he finds his younger self describing the house on the canal where mother lay dying. The memory is tied to the experience of sitting on a bench by a weir from where I could see her window, where I sat in the biting wind, wishing she were gone. And he recalls throwing a ball for a dog, waiting for the blind on the window of the nursing home to be lowered, which would be customary when someone died. I happened to look up, and there it was, all over and done with at last. I sat on for a few moments with the ball in my hand and the dog yelping and pawing at me. Moments, my moments, her moments, the dog's moments. In the end, I held it out to him and he took it in his mouth, gently, gently. A small, old, black, hard, solid rubber ball. I shall feel it in my hands until my dying day. I might have kept it, but I gave it to the dog. Now likewise, Thomas Kinsella would live most of his life in this area around the Pepper Canister Church, Pearse Place, Herbert Place. He first rented a room in Baggot Street, but he eventually bought a house at 47 Pearse Place. Kinsella was also somebody who kept his distance from the literary pubs that people like Patrick Kavanaugh frequented. His poem Open House describes a typical Dublin literary pub as an overcrowded sty. But his poetry returns again and again to this area around Pearse Place, Herbert Place, the Pepper Canister Church. His 1958 collection, Another September, contains a haunting evocation of the area at night, Baggot Street, Deserta. He would revisit the area in other poems from the collection Poems from the City Centre, 1990. This includes poems such as The Stable, about a stable that once existed in Percy Lane, The Bell, about the bell on the Haddington Road Church, Disturbing the Sanctuary Lamp, Cup of Blood, Seed of Light, Hanging Down from the Dark Height. And he would actually name the poetry press that he founded after the Pepper Canister Church. But I want to finish up in this part of the city by bringing us back toward the Canal, to Herbert Place. For all the writers who wrote and performed plays and published poetry in this area around the Grand Canal and Pepper Canister Church, the only one actually to have been born here is Elizabeth Bowen. Now, that may come as a surprise, because when we think about Bowen, we tend to associate her with Ireland's big country houses, particularly Bowen's Court that her family owned, which is so vividly evoked in her 1929 novel, The Last September, or in her autobiographical account, Bowen's Court. But she was actually born at 15 Herbert Place. Like many families with large country estates, at the time, Bowen was born in 1899, her family had a Dublin address. And so Elizabeth Bowen was born in what she describes as that row of smallish, light brown Georgian houses with high steps fronting on the canal. And she describes the rooms at the front of the house as having a watery quality in their lightness from the upcast reflections of the canal. Her earliest memories are of that light and of walking through Dublin with her governess. And she vividly recalls this in her wonderful memoir, 7 Winters. On my walks through familiar quarters of Dublin, she writes, I looked at everything like a spy. Now, Bowen's Dublin in her memoir radiates something like a human personality. She goes on walks with her governess, and the Georgian squares appear to her cryptic and austere. Even along the verges of Stephen's Green, there were canyon-like streets that produced a charnel fear of grave dust and fungus dust. At junctures, the child's sense of the city as somehow sentient emerges with the mature writer's awareness of historical change. Often, she writes, I felt a malign temper at work. Stories of gloom would add themselves to the houses till these shut out the sky. The street tautened and the distances frowned. Walking down Upper Mount Street or Lower Baggot Street, I had at once the feeling of being in the wrong, and Leeson Street became a definite threat. The tyrannical grandness of this quarter seemed to exist for itself alone. Perhaps a child smells history without knowing it. I did not know that I looked at the tomb of fashion. And Bowen is living here. It's her first 7 years of life from 1899 to 1906. She's living in this part of Dublin, just as the wealthy families who had built these houses around the canal were moving out, and the buildings were turning into offices and were being broken up into flats, the same flats that people like Brendan Behan, Patrick Kavanagh, and so many others would move into. So for Bowen, Upper Baggot Street was not where you went to Searson's pub for a steadying morning drink. It was where you went shopping with your governess, where everyone not only had manners, but time. We nearby residents made this our own village. And yet this Dublin neighbourhood of crinolined governesses and polite children occupies the same streets in which Brendan Behan, who would later live one street away from where Elizabeth Bowen was born, would come roaring home at dawn singing obscene ballads. In fact, had the young Elizabeth Bowen been able to look out her nursery window at 15 Herbert Place, directly down into the lane behind her, Herbert Lane, she would be looking down into where the Pike Theater would be located in the 1950s. The reason Herbert Lane exists at all was to provide people like the Bowens with somewhere to stable their horses. And of course, it was in Herbert Lane in 1955 that during the Pike's Irish premiere of Beckett's Waiting for Godot, the character of Pozzo, who addresses his servant Lucky as Pig, would be dressed and would have spoken very much like an Anglo-Irish gentleman. In fact, very much like Bowen's father. And so I imagine a literary city where time has become jumbled. And a young Elizabeth Bowen, still a child, looks out her nursery window into the lane behind her house and sees there a young John Banville, a John Montague, a Thomas Kinsella, followed by Patrick Kavanagh and Brendan Behan, emerging from having watched Waiting for Godot, followed perhaps by Beckett himself. And then finally, the characters of Vladimir and Estragon, and finally Pozzo, looking for all the world like Bowen's own father, staring back up at her. And all of that, I imagine, within streets that, on an ordinary day, we would walk down commenting on only their quietness, their stillness, their absence of presence. Now, I don't know about you, but that makes me want to go back out onto the streets of Dublin and see what other hidden literary neighbourhoods are hiding in plain sight. If the bank of the Grand Canal, just beyond Baggot Street Bridge, is one of the places in the south side of Dublin where we feel the presence of Dublin's writers, its counterpart on the north side must be number 7 Ekla Street, home to Leopold and Molly Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, of course, the irony here is that it no longer exists. It was approximately here on the northeastern side of the street where the Mater Private Hospital is today. Now, this whole part of Dublin is Joyce country. The first story in Dubliners opens with the narrator looking up at the lighted square of the window of a house in Great Britain Street, which is now Parnell Street. In the second story, in Encounter, we're told that the narrator's friends went to 8 o'clock Mass every morning in Gardiner Street. The next story, Araby, begins with a description of a nearby street. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except at the hour when the Christian Brothers' School was set free. The Joyce family actually lived at number 17 North Richmond Street from 1894 to 1898, and they rented rooms earlier on Hardwicke Street, which is where the boarding house is set. And they later moved not too far from Richmond Street to 32 Glengariff Parade, which is just behind Mountjoy Prison. Now, we could make a number of literary connections here from Glengariff Parade. Glengariff Parade runs down the side of Mountjoy Jail and connects with Inishfallen Parade, which is where Sean O'Casey's family lived for a time after moving from Dorset Street, where he'd been born. But I'm going to go in a different direction. If we go back up North Richmond Street and take a slight turn, we come to North Richmond Cottages, which is now where there's a marvellous mural by the street artist Shane Sutton of Brendan Behan. And I want to keep Bean in mind because he's going to reappear here for us on the north side. But let's go back first to Ekla Street. If we start at number 7 Ekla Street, or at least where it was, and let's explore the streets around it, this most famous of literary addresses. If you walk down Ekla Street, you come to Dorset Street. Walk along Dorset Street, and you come to Blessington Street. Walk up Blessington Street, there's a little bit of Berkeley Street, and you come to Nelson Street, which will bring us back around to Eklas. So there's our little loop. Doesn't seem to be an area that's rich with literary memories. But let's go back to the library and have another look in the shelves, because I think what we'll find is that this part of the city is just as rich as the area that we looked at on the south side. When I first start looking for references, literary references to Dorset Street, the first name I meet, of course, is Sean O'Casey, who was born on the street in 1880 at number 85, Upper Dorset Street. In the previous century, the playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan was actually born not too far away at 12 Dorset Street. When Sheridan was born there, the houses were still fashionable. They were houses that were owned by the upper middle classes, in some cases aristocracy. Sheridan's mother, Frances Sheridan, was a playwright, and his father, Thomas Sheridan, was not only a playwright, he was the manager of the Smock Alley Theatre, and he managed to provoke actually 2 theatre riots. The house in Dorset Street was a modest and elegant house at the same time, writes R.B. Sheridan's biographer Fintan O'Toole. A solid 4-story building in a newly developed part of Dublin, newly developed in the 18th century. Respectable, but not ostentatious. Well, think about this for a minute. If Sheridan was one of the most successful and enduring playwrights of the 18th century, the same is probably true for the 19th century of Dion Boucicault, who in 1820 was born around the corner from Dorset Street at the north end of Gardiner Street. For instance, when his play The Colleen Bawn opened in Dublin's Theatre Royal in Hawkins Street in 1861, it was one of the theatrical events of that century, of the 19th century. Dubliners took the horses from his carriage and pulled his carriage themselves through the streets on opening night. It was such a triumph. Think about this. Metre for metre, I doubt if there are many other streets in the world in which there was a major playwright born in the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century, so close to one another. Did you know that not a stone's throw from us was born Sean O'Casey, author of The Plough and the Stars? Brendan Behan's mother, Kathleen, asked in her autobiography, Mother of All the Behans. For 14 years, in the 1920s and 30s, the Behans lived at 14 Russell Street, which is where Brendan Behan was born, in what he describes as a Georgian house that had gone to rack and ruin as a tenement, had 1 toilet for 14 families. Now, Russell Street is just right up by Croke Park, so we're in this same area, not too far away. He was the first actual writer I saw, the poet Paula Meehan recalls. My father pointed him out to me. He was staggering from Murray's public house on Sean McDermott Street. A great writer, but a terrible messer, was my father's verdict. I don't want to give the impression that Russell Street was the worst slum in Dublin, Kathleen Behan would later note. But she said, in fact, it was more on the fringes of slumdom, though heaven knows nobody today would put up with the conditions there. For all the overflowing lavatories and fights between drunken old bowsies, I was living like a queen compared to the people in the Diamond. Now, this is Behan's home territory, this area around Russell Street, around the Royal Canal, and coming down into Dorset Street. He actually moved out of there when he was 14. The house in which he lived, the tenement, was condemned. It had been owned by his grandmother, and the family were moved to Crumlin. Here's Kathleen Behan's account of this. She describes Eamon de Valera building new housing estates in Crumlin in the 1930s. He built those great housing estates like something you'd see in Siberia, she wrote. It was a terrible thing to move half the city out to the sides of mountains without schools, buses or shops. Out in the slums, we lived a rebellious, anarchic life that didn't suit the new Ireland at all. I think the idea of Crumlin and Kimmage as Siberia as being distant from the city centre seems strange to us today. But for the people, the Beans growing up in the city centre, it seemed to them like they'd been moved, as she says, to the sides of mountains. I remember when we got our notice to get moving, recalled Bean himself, hearing one owl one moaning to my mother, "Oh, Mrs. Bean, Jewel and darling, don't go to Kimmage. That's where they ate their young." 4 miles or no more it was, says Bean, where this cannibalism took place. So for Bean, where he grew up in these streets around Russell Street would become his imaginative territory. And it would be here that he would set most of the plays on which his reputation rests. So The Queerfellow, which premiered in the Pike Theater in Herbert Lane, actually takes place in Mountjoy Prison, just a few streets over from where he was born. And we know this because at the beginning, a prisoner sings the song The Old Triangle, which goes jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal, which is literally at the end of Russell Street. But it's his later play, The Hostage, which brings us back to the hidden neighbourhood around Ekla Street. Now, The Hostage is basically, it's about a group of IRA men who take a British soldier hostage, is actually set in Nelson Street, in what the stage directions described as an old house that has seen better days. Now, one of the things that you notice about this play is that all the inhabitants of the house have the kind of nicknames that were once so common in the North Inner City. At one point, an inspector arrives at the door and requests a list of the tenants in the Nelson Street house. The names listed off include Pig's Eye, Bobo, The Mouse, Ropine. And while both these plays, The Queerfellow and The Hostage, are far from plotless, The Queerfellow is set on the night before an execution, The Hostage involves hostage taking, what really drives them is an exuberant delight in character and language. And in this respect, Bean is really what many people thought him to be, the successor to Sean O'Casey. The tenement plays, writes Paula Meehan, of Sean O'Casey were wonderfully affirmative, as I had lived amongst the children and grandchildren of his characters, and I never agreed with the notion that he wrote caricatures. If people have nothing except their personalities, then there is an art to being in the world that might come across as larger than life. And I think that's true of O'Casey, but it's also true of Bean. Now, the tenements of the North Inner City in the first half of the 20th century have a continuing life in Dublin's literature. And I could spend days here in Pearse Street Library reading through the literature of the tenements. I could pull down from the shelves, for instance, James Stephen's wonderful 1912 novel, The Charwoman's Daughter. Or, the obvious one, James Plunkett's Strumpet City from 1963. Or I could take a detour by way of theatre to Maura Laverty's play Liffey Lane from 1951, for which the Abbey Theatre's just done an audio production. But I want to save the tenements for another talk. I want to keep to what the writer Iris Murdoch calls the pockets of gloomy respectability that existed in the North Side alongside the tenements. Because just as Elizabeth Bowen was born in the middle of Bagatonia on the South Side, the writer Iris Murdoch, who we might not normally associate with Dublin's North Inner City, was actually born in 1919 at number 59 Blessington Street, literally around the corner from Ekla Street. Now, the house is still there, but her family moved to England when she was about 12. At the same time, she continued to think of herself throughout her life as Irish. One of her biographers, in fact, Peter J. Conradi, says, a lifetime's investment in Irishness, visible in every decade of her life, was a source of reassurance, a reference point, a credential, somewhere to start out from and to return to. Now, as I say, this is surprising because Murdoch eventually settled in Oxford, lived the last 40 years of her life there with her partner John Bailey. She wrote 26 novels, 2 collections of poetry, 5 plays, and 5 books of philosophy. So she was very much a kind of Oxford writer, writing novels and philosophy alongside one another. But her 1965 novel, The Red and the Green, is set in Dublin. And in fact, she uses the street where she was born as a home for one of her characters. The character's named Cathal Dumas, and his house is on Blessington Street. Let me read you the passage. The Dumas house stood at the upper end of Blessington Street, a wide, sad, dirty street due north of the Pillar, which crawled up the hill and ended at the railings of a melancholy little park. It had, under the pale bright sky, its own quiet air of dereliction. A street leading nowhere, always full of idling dogs and open doorways. Yet, in form, it closely resembled the other great Georgian arteries of Dublin, with its noble continuous facade of sombre black and red brick, which seemed to absorb, rather than be revealed by, the perpetual rainy light. Looked at closely, the bricks of these houses showed, in fact, a variety of colours, some purplish red, some yellowish grey, all glued together by a jelly of filth to form a uniform organic surface, rather like the scales of a fish, the basic material of Dublin. I think that's a great description of those streets. Now let's remind ourselves, this is Blessington Street, where Iris Murdoch is born, where Iris Murdoch sets this novel, The Green and the Red, or The Red and the Green, where her character Cathal Dumas lives. And it runs parallel to Ekla Street, where the fictional Molly and Leopold Bloom live in Joyce's Ulysses. And to get from Ekla Street to Blessington Street, you either go by Dorset Street, in which case we could drop in on either the O'Caseys or the Sheridans, depending on which century we imagine ourselves in, or we could go the other way by Nelson Street, in which case we might run into one of the characters from Brendan Behan's The Hostage, say Pig's Eye. And then we might imagine all these characters, authors, all together, the Blooms, Pig's Eye, Cathal Dumas, all together in this little nest of innocuous-looking north side streets, encountering one another, perhaps out for the morning papers. And I think that's what I mean by a city of literature and its hidden light. There's a sequence of poems that Paula Meehan has written called The Lost Children of the Inner City. And she has a line that goes like this. We read our city like an open book. Who was taken and what was took. Spelt out in brick and mortar. A history lesson for every mother's daughter. Dublin's north inner city, perhaps all of Dublin, is best understood, as Paula Meehan intimates here, as a kind of book in which stories of changing lives are written in the bricks, with some lines scratched out, others written on top of them, like a great palimpsest. And as you wander through those streets today, mingling with the ghosts of Sheridan, O'Casey, Behan, Iris Murdoch, today what you'll run across are Vietnamese restaurants, Polish groceries, halal butchers. And as these new Dubliners find a literary voice, they too add to the layers of these streets. So the Sao Paulo-born Dublin poet Rafael Mendes, in his poem 32 Kilo Suitcase, writes, "Before I left home, I packed a 32 kilo suitcase. If I was to come back, what would I pack? A red brick from Henrietta Street, a slang dictionary from the north inner city, Burdock's Fish and Chips, bookshops, books upstairs and chapters, fragments of stories from smokers huddled in doorways." And that's where I want to leave things, with two observations about the way in which our literary city is changing. On one hand, I worry that things like spiraling property prices will change the kind of literary neighbourhoods where Leland Bardwell could rent a flat for £2 a week around the corner from Patrick Kavanagh and John Montague. On the other hand, when I see a young writer like Rafael Mendes bringing his experience into the literary mix, I feel uplifted in the hope that Dublin as a writer's city will continue to reinvent itself as it changes and as we continue to add chapters to the sometimes hidden book of the city of Dublin as a city of literature.